She could hear the men building the scaffold in the prison yard, and she had been listening for 2 hours, counting the sounds the way you count things when there is nothing else to do with the time. The knock of timber on timber, the resonance of a crossbeam being set. She had been convicted of murdering a man she went to help, sentenced by a judge who had decided the verdict before the witness finished speaking, and in 4 hours the scaffold would be ready. She stopped being afraid somewhere in the 2nd hour. The fear had simply reached a ceiling, and what remained on the other side was a clarity about what she could not change and what she still could. She had delivered medicine to a dying man, and someone had used that visit to hang her. What she did not know, until the bolt on her cell door moved at 1:30 in the morning, was that someone had spent 6 months reading the trial record and had finally found what was wrong with it. The bolt moved. She was on her feet before it finished moving, which was the instinct of someone who had been sleeping lightly for 6 months in a place where the sound of a bolt meant something was happening, whether she was ready for it or not. It was not the guard. The guards had changed an hour ago, and the new one was a man named Fetch, who had brought her water every night for 6 months without speaking to her, which she had understood as a form of apology that he could make without risking anything. And this was not his movement. This was someone who did not know where the bolt was in the dark and was finding it by feel, which meant someone who had not done this before. The door opened. A man she had not seen before stood in the frame, with a lantern held low and a sheaf of papers under his arm, and the expression of a man who has been moving toward a moment for a long time, and has arrived at it, and is not certain of the reception. He was broad through the chest and shoulders, with dark brown hair going gray at the sideburns, and gray-green eyes that were steady and unhurried in the particular way of someone who has learned not to show urgency, because urgency makes situations worse. He had a healed scar along his left jaw, faint in the lantern light, the kind of scar that had settled into the face over years and become part of the general landscape of it. He wore plain dark work clothes that had seen hard years without apology. He said, "My name is Amos." He said, "I was a marshal in this county 6 years ago." He said, "I have been reading your trial transcript for 6 months, and I found something on page 31 that should not be there." She said, "Who let you in here?" He said, "I asked the duty officer." He said, "The duty officer was not certain my authority had lapsed, and I did not clarify the matter." She said, "That duty officer will face consequences for this." He said, "I am aware." He said, "I made that calculation before I came." She looked at him. She was still standing. She had not sat back down. In 6 months, she had learned that standing was the correct posture for things that required a response, and sitting was the correct posture for things that were already done, and she was not yet sure which category this fell into. She said, "What is on page 31? He set the lantern on the floor and found the page. He read her the passage. It was in Reeves' testimony, the business partner who had said he saw her leaving the store. In the course of his testimony, Reeve had described the position of Pollard's body on the floor. He had described it with a specificity that the prosecuting counsel had not questioned, and that the defense counsel, who was a young man overwhelmed by the case, had not noticed. The body was face down, the right arm extended, the left arm beneath the torso. She said, "I left him in his chair. He was in his chair when I left. I gave him the medicine, and he was weak, but he was upright, and I left him in his chair." Amos said, "I know." He said, "The inquest noted the body was found face down on the floor." He said, "Reeve knew how the body was positioned before anyone but the killer and the coroner would have known it." She looked at him. The men in the yard had stopped hammering. The scaffold was finished. She said, "He said he was my only witness." He said, "He was the only witness." He said, "And he knew where the body was, because he put it there." If you have made it this far into Tess's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I have been waiting to tell you. The bolt had moved. She had been on her feet, and now she was sitting on the edge of her cot, because her legs had made a decision that the rest of her had not caught up with yet. She said, "Why have you been reading the transcript for 6 months?" He said, "Because I was a marshal 6 years ago." He said it plainly, without decoration, the way a man delivers a statement of fact that he is not proud of and is not asking to be forgiven for. He set the lantern down between them and sat with his back against the cell wall, the way a man sits when he intends to stay long enough to say a complete thing. He said, 6 years ago, in a county 200 miles east of here, a man named Reeve made an accusation against an innocent person. I was the marshal. I took his testimony. I believed him because his testimony was specific and confident, and I did not look at it long enough to find the thing that was wrong with it. The man he accused went to prison for 2 years and was released on a technicality that did not include an acknowledgement that he was innocent. He said, "I have been carrying that for 6 years." He said, "When I heard what Reeve testified at your trial, something in it felt wrong in a way I recognized, and I have spent 6 months trying to find out what." She said, "And you found it on page 31. He said, "I found it on page 31. She said, "What do you do with it now?" He said, "There is an appellate judge on the morning train, Judge Harden. He arrives at 5. The execution is scheduled at 6. He said, "A territorial appellate judge can issue an emergency stay if the grounds are sufficient." He said, "I believe the grounds are sufficient." He said, "The question is whether I can get Harden to believe it in the 40 minutes between his arrival and your scheduled execution." She said, "That is not much time." He said, "No." She said, "And you came here first, before Harden arrives?" He said, "I came here first because there is something I need from you." He said, "There is a medicine pouch in the prison effects log with Pollard's name on it and your handwriting on the label. It was your legitimate reason for being at the store that night. It was never entered as evidence." He said, "I need you to tell me about it, and I need you to walk out of this cell and come with me." She looked at him. She said, "Walk out of this cell." He said, "The duty officer did not lock it behind me when he opened it." She said, "And if I walk out, that is an escape. That is a charge on top of the conviction." He said, "Yes." He said, "I made that calculation too." He said, "If Hardin issues the stay, it becomes irrelevant." He said, "If Hardin does not issue the stay, the escape becomes the least of your concerns." She looked at the lantern on the floor between them. That was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in 6 months, and she held it for a moment before she answered. 4 hours was not much. It was enough to build a scaffold. She did not know yet if it was enough to stop one. He said, "There is a medicine pouch in the prison effects log. It is tagged with Pollard's name, and it has your handwriting on it. It was your reason for being there that night. It was never entered as evidence because your counsel did not know it existed." She said, "Pollard asked me for the medicine 3 days before he died. His clerk arranged it. There was an arrangement between us for his illness that winter, and the clerk who arranged it can confirm it." Amos said, "I know about the clerk." He said, "I have a statement from him already." She looked at him again. She said, "You have been thorough." He said, "I have had 6 months." She said, "What do you need from me?" He said, "There is an appellate judge on the morning train. He arrives at 5. The execution is scheduled for 6. He said, "A territorial appellate judge can issue a stay on emergency grounds if the grounds are presented to him before the execution is carried out." He said, "I need you to walk out of this cell with me now, and go with me to find the midwife, because the midwife has something she has been too afraid to produce for 6 months, and tonight is the last time she will be asked." She said, "What does the midwife have?" He said, "She saw Reeve leaving the store that night, at an hour that puts him there after you had gone." He said, "And she received a written message from Reeve after the trial that she understood as a warning to stay quiet." He said, "She has kept the message." She said, "She has kept it for 6 months and not come forward." He said, "She is afraid of Drum." She said, "She is right to be." He said, "Yes." He said, "But Drum is not the judge tonight. Hardin is." She stood. She pulled her coat from the hook by the door, the coat they had let her keep, the one thing from outside that still smelled like outside. She said, "Let us go find the midwife." The prison yard was quiet when they went through it. The scaffold stood in the corner of the yard where it always stood, which was a detail she had not known until she was walking past it and understood that this was a permanent structure, not built for her specifically, but waiting for whoever the next occasion required. She did not look at it directly. She looked at the gate. The town was sleeping, the particular sleep of a frontier town in the last hours before dawn. Not fully dark, not beginning to lighten, a middle hour with no name that belonged to the people who had reasons to be awake in it. She and Amos moved through the empty streets at a pace that was not quite running. He had the papers under his arm and the lantern in his hand, and the steady movement of a man who has made his decision and is past the point of second-guessing it. She had the coat and the particular state of someone who has been certain of death for 6 months and is now, in the last hour before it, being asked to entertain the possibility of something else, and does not know yet whether she can afford to. Cass lived above the apothecary on the 2nd Street, in 2 rooms with a window that faced the alley. The light was on when they arrived, which was either because Cass never slept well, or because she had been listening to the scaffold, too. Amos knocked. A long pause, the kind of pause that is not absence, but decision. The door opened. Cass was a woman of 60, with the hands of someone who had delivered 300 babies, and the eyes of someone who had seen most of what could happen to people, and had her own opinions about it. She looked at Tess first, then at Amos, then back at Tess. She said, "I know why you are here." Tess said, "Then you know what I need." Cass said, "I know what Reeve did. I have known it for 6 months." She said it with the weight of someone who has been carrying something they should have set down and could not, because setting it down had consequences, and carrying it also had consequences, and she had spent 6 months unable to choose which consequence was smaller. She said, "I was there that night. I was on the 2nd Street when I saw him leaving the store. I knew what it meant. I knew what I had seen. 3 days later I received a message, and I understood what would happen if I said what I knew." Tess said, "Then set it down now." She said, "There is not much mourning left." Cass went to the cabinet beside the window and took from the back of the highest shelf a folded piece of paper, worn at the creases from being handled and refolded over 6 months. She placed it on the table. It was Reeve's message to her. It was not explicitly a threat. It never was with men like Reeve. It said that he had heard she had been in the vicinity of the store that evening, and that he hoped she understood the importance of accuracy in matters of testimony, and that he was a man who remembered the people who had helped him, and equally the people who had not. It was the language of a man who understood that the word threat was something to be avoided, and the thing threat meant was something to be implied. And it was written in Reeve's hand. She said, "What happens to me if he finds out before morning?" Amos said, "We are going to get to Hardin before Reeve knows the train came in." She said, "How long do we have?" He said, "Hardin's train was moved up. It arrives at 4, not 5. He said, "I found this out an hour ago and came straight to the prison." He said, "We have 90 minutes. Cass looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Tess. She said, "Has he been honest with you about what this costs him?" Tess looked at Amos. He said, "The appellate judge I am bringing this to is a man named Hardin." He said, "I appeared before Hardin twice when I was a marshal. The first time I was right, and the second time I was not." He said, "The second time was the Cimarron case, and Hardin knows it, and what I am going to have to do tonight is stand in front of him and tell him that Reeve did the same thing twice, and I was the instrument of it the first time." Cass said, "Does that make it more likely Hardin will issue the stay, or less likely?" Amos said, "I do not know." He said it plainly. He said, "I know it makes it more likely that what I say is believed, because a man does not generally confess his own failures unless the failures are real." Cass was quiet. She picked up the note from the table and folded it back along its creases. She placed it in Amos's hand. She said, "I will come with you." Hardin's train pulled into the station at 4 minutes past 4, ahead of its scheduled arrival, and behind the hour it had originally been due, and exactly on time for what was needed. He was a thin man with the compressed energy of someone who had spent 30 years deciding things and had not lost the appetite for it. He came down from the train with a traveling bag and the expression of a man who has been told there is an emergency at 4 in the morning and is reserving judgment about whether the emergency merits the hour. Amos met him on the platform before he had taken 3 steps. He said, "Judge Hardin?" He said, "My name is Amos." He said, "You know who I am." Hardin looked at him for a moment. He said, "I know who you are." He said it without inflection, which meant Amos had appeared before him on the wrong side of something, and they both knew it. Amos said, "There is a woman scheduled to be executed at 6 o'clock this morning, on evidence I believe to be manufactured." He said, "I have the trial transcript with the passage that demonstrates the witness had knowledge he could not have had except as the perpetrator." He said, "I have the midwife who saw the witness leaving the premises at the relevant time." He said, "I have the written warning the witness sent to the midwife to keep her from coming forward for 6 months." He said, "I have a statement from the deceased's clerk that establishes the defendant's legitimate reason for being at the premises on the night in question." He placed the papers in Hardin's hands. He said, "And I need to tell you something about the Cimarron case." Hardin looked at the papers, then at Amos, then at the papers again. He said, "Tell me on the way to the light." The station-keeper had a lamp and a table at the end of the platform, and Hardin read there, standing, with Tess and Cass behind Amos, in the sound of the train settling on the tracks in the dark. He read the transcript passage. He put it down. He picked it up and read it again. He read Reeves' note to Cass. He read Amos's statement about Cimarron. He read the clerk's statement about the medicine arrangement. He read without speaking, and the platform was quiet except for the train and the wind off the open land and the sound of the station clock marking the time. He was quiet for a long moment after he finished. He said, "Where is Drum?" Amos said, "The hotel." Hardin said, "Where is Reeve?" Reeve was not at his rooms. That was what the man Amos had sent arrived to report at 4:15, breathing hard, with the information that Reeve's horse was gone from the livery, and his rooms were empty, and had been empty for some time. Someone at the station had sent word ahead, a contact of Reeve's, someone who had seen the train come in early and understood what it meant. Amos said, "Go to Drum." He looked at Tess. He said, "Take Cass and Hardin to Drum." He said, "I will find Reeve." She said, "You cannot fight Reeve alone." He said, "I am not going to fight him." He said, "I am going to get between him and Cass before he reaches her." He said, "A man who knows his witness is about to speak does not go to the judge. He goes to the witness." She said, "You cannot fight Reeve alone." He said, "I am not going to fight him." He said, "I am going to get between him and Cass before he does." He was right about where Reeve was going. A man who knows his witness is about to speak goes to the witness, not to the judge. He does not try to stop the law. He tries to stop the person the law is listening to. Amos reached Cass's door 4 minutes before Reeve did. He knew it was 4 minutes because he heard the horse on the street when he arrived at her door, and he counted while he stood in the narrow alley between the apothecary and the building beside it, back against the wall, in the dark that was only barely beginning to lighten at the edges. Reeve came up the alley on foot, horse tied at the street. He saw Amos. He stopped. He said, "You took my testimony 6 years ago." Amos said, "I know." He said, "You believed me." Amos said, "I did." He said, "I should not have." Reeve moved, not for his gun, but sideways toward the door, the calculation of a man who has assessed the situation and decided his priority is the witness behind the door and not the man in front of it. Amos stepped into him, not drawing, planting, the way a man who has been broad through the shoulders for 30 years plants himself when he has decided something is not getting past him. Reeve hit him with his elbow in the left side, and Amos felt it and did not move. He put his hand on Reeve's coat and held, and they stood in the alley in the last of the dark, with Amos holding and Reeve not free. And Reeve tried once more, and then the deputy Amos had sent a message to arrived from the street end of the alley, and the question was settled. Hardin had Drum at a table in the hotel by 4:30. Drum was in his night clothes with a robe over them, and the expression of a man who had not expected to be sitting in his own hotel room before dawn with an appellate judge and a woman who was supposed to be dead at 6 sitting near his door. Hardin set the papers on the table. He did not explain them. He did not contextualize them or prepare Drum for what they contained. He simply placed them in front of him and said, "Read these." Tess stood near the door with Cass beside her. She had not spoken since the hotel. She had been in the cell for 6 months, and she understood that the most dangerous thing she could do in the next 20 minutes was say something that gave Drum a reason to focus on her rather than on the papers. Drum read the transcript passage. He set it down and took up the note Reeve had sent Cass, the threat that was not a threat. He read the clerk's statement. His expression did not change during the reading, in the careful way of someone who has decided that not changing their expression is a form of control, and is exercising it deliberately. He said, "The conviction was lawfully rendered." Hardin said, "The conviction was rendered on testimony that contained specific knowledge of the victim's position that the witness could not have had if he had only been present before the victim died." He said it quietly, the way a man states a conclusion that does not require volume. Drum said, "A discrepancy in testimony does not void a conviction." Hardin said, "It creates sufficient grounds for an emergency review, which is what I am conducting." He said, "I will need the original trial record produced." Drum said, "It is not here." Hardin said, "Then I suggest someone go and get it." While the hotel clerk was sent to the courthouse for the record, Amos came in with the deputy and Reeve in custody. Reeve had a cut above his left eye from the alley. He was not restrained beyond the deputy's hand on his arm, but he moved like a restrained man, with the particular stillness of someone who has understood that the situation has moved beyond what his own movement can affect. Drum looked at Reeve. Tess watched Drum look at Reeve, and she understood in that moment what Amos had understood months ago, that Drum had known. Not the details, not the mechanism, but the category of thing. He had known Reeve was useful, and had not looked closely at the cost of that usefulness. And now the cost was standing in his hotel room at 4:30 in the morning in the custody of a deputy, and Drum was alone with the bill. Amos said, "I want to say something." Hardin said, "Say it." Amos said, 6 years ago in Cimarron County, this man made a false accusation against an innocent person, and I was the marshal who believed him. He said, the man he accused served 2 years in prison and was released on a technicality that did not include acknowledgement that he was innocent. He said, I believed Reeve because his testimony was specific and confident, and I did not question it carefully enough, and a man lost 2 years of his life because I did not do my job. He said, I found this out 3 years after the fact, and I have carried it since, and when Tess was convicted on Reeve's testimony, I recognized the pattern, and I have spent 6 months establishing what I should have established the first time. He said, Reeve has done this before. He said, I was the instrument of it the first time. He said, I am here tonight because I was not there to stop it the first time, and I will not miss it twice. The room was quiet, in the particular way of rooms where something true has been said that everyone present recognizes as true and is deciding what to do with. Hardin looked at Drum. Drum looked at Reeve. Reeve said nothing. His silence in that room was as complete and as damning as anything he could have said, and everyone in the room understood it as such. Drum picked up the pen. He held it for a moment. He looked at the stay order. He looked at Hardin. He looked at the stay order again. He signed it with the expression of a man who has made the calculation about what is survivable and what is not, and has arrived at an answer that preserves the parts he most values and knows that everyone in the room can see the calculation happening and has decided that being seen making it is preferable to the alternative. The alternative was everything Amos had just said being repeated in a territorial court with Hardin presiding, which was a proceeding Drum would not survive professionally, which was the only survival that mattered to him. Drum signed the stay. She walked out of the prison at 5:47 in the morning, 13 minutes before the scheduled execution, into the particular quality of light that belongs to the open frontier in the first minutes after dawn, when the sky is still more gray than gold, and the grass on the open land moves with the wind that comes before the sun is properly up. She had her coat. She had the medicine pouch back in her pocket, retrieved from the effects room by the duty officer who had produced it without meeting her eyes, which was the correct response for a man who had held it on a shelf for 6 months while it sat there, being evidence of a thing that nobody had asked him about at the time. She had taken it from his hands and tucked it in her pocket without opening it, because she knew what was inside, and she did not need to check. She stood on the step outside the prison door and put her hand on the door frame, which was the first solid thing she had touched that was not the inside of the prison in 6 months, and she let herself have one moment of that before she walked down the step into the morning. Amos was outside, standing at the road. He looked like a man who had not slept and had been hit in the left side, and had stood in front of a judge and said the most difficult true thing he had been carrying for 6 years, all in the space of 4 hours. He looked, in other words, like a man who had done what he came to do. She walked down to where he was standing. She said, "The man in Cimarron, the one you put away." He said, "His name is Baxter." He said, "I wrote to him 3 weeks ago, when I was certain enough about what I had found that I knew tonight was coming." She said, "Did he write back?" He said, "Not yet." He said it without softening it, which was the right way to say it. She looked at the land in front of them, the open range, the particular stillness of a frontier morning before the day has properly committed to being one. She said, "What do you do now?" He said, "I have a freight operation east of town that has not been properly attended to for 6 months. He said, "It will not run itself." She said, "I know someone who needs work." He looked at her. She said, "I was good at what I did." She said, "Pollard knew it. He engaged me because he knew it." She said, "The ranches east of town know it too, and word will have gotten out that I am not dead, and some of them will need what I know how to do before the cold season is over." He said, "They will." She said, "Then I will get back to it." He said, "All right." They stood for a while in the first light of the morning, not talking, not needing to. The kind of standing that happens when 2 people have been through something enormous together, and the enormousness is still settling, and there is nothing to say that is large enough to be the right size for it yet. And both of them understand that, and neither of them tries to find the words anyway. If Tess's story stayed with you, we would love to know which moment you will carry longest. Was it the moment she heard the bolt move on her cell door at 1:30 in the morning, after 6 months of a sentence she did not earn? Or was it the moment Amos stood in that hotel room and told the judge the true thing about Cimarron, knowing what it cost him because he had missed Reeve once and would not miss him twice? If you know someone who was failed by the very system that was supposed to protect them and kept going anyway, share this story with them. It may be exactly what they need to hear. Like this video if it moved you. If you want more stories from the frontier, subscribe to this channel and leave us a comment below telling us whether you think Baxter ever wrote back to Amos, because we read every one of them. The prairie opened east of the town in the first light of the morning, the grass moving without wind across the wide, flat land, and the sky above it was the particular gray gold of the frontier at dawn. And somewhere in that light, 2 people were walking toward the ordinary work of an ordinary day, which was the thing Tess had been trying to get back to for 6 months and had finally reached.